Well, welcome to Voices of Women. I'm your host, Chris Stanis, and also the founder of Women of Wisdom Foundation, which has been around since 1993. We're having our 30th annual Women of Wisdom Conference. It's March 24th through the 27th. It's online again this year, and last year it was very successful and drew people from all over the country. Our theme this year is celebrating our sacred pearls, nourishing the waters of the feminine. We have lots of experiential workshops to choose from, and also panel discussions on topics of interest for women, such as racial equity, spiritual activism, and the feminine perspective from different religions. Our special guest this year includes the internationally known author Riane Eisler, who I have with me today. You can read about the conference at womanofwisdom.org. So Riane Eisler is a social system scientist, futurist, cultural historian, attorney, consultant, and speaker whose work has transformed organizations, policies, and people worldwide. She is internationally known for her bestseller, The Chalice and The Blade, Our History, Our Future. This book is one of the defining books on the sacred feminine. So it's perfect that she is at Women of Wisdom. And this is her third time being at Women of Wisdom. And she's also in the Women of Wisdom book that I put together that is a compilation of many of the speakers that came to Women of Wisdom. So this book, research and vision, have empowered generations of women and men to work for the urgently needed cultural transformation to a truly egalitarian partnership society, as opposed to authoritarianism and domination. Another important book of Riane's is Sacred Pleasure, which was hailed by Gloria Steinem as Eisler's most stunning, far-reaching, and practical gift, both to readers and a world that must change or perish. And now her newest book is Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. It provides a new perspective on our past, present, and future, in which women and the feminine are such as caring, caregiving, and nonviolence are truly valued and honored. So you can check Riane out at her website, www.centerforpartnership.org, and also rianeeisler.com. And Riane is going to speak at the conference on March 25th. Her topic is Valuing the Feminine, Building a Partnership World. So welcome, Riane.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, so wow, your book, The Chalice and the Blade, it's in its 35th year. And it is still an important and a valid book for women and men to read and study, isn't it? It's still current.
It's more current than ever. It's now in its, 57th US printing, and in over 35 foreign editions. It just came out in a new Spanish edition, and it attracted a media storm of interviews in Spain, women and men, who said almost uniformly, this book gives us grounded hope for a better future.
Oh, and we so need that hope. We so do. And your whole working life, your whole life has been to bring about this transformation from dominator to a partnership model. And we all see the need for this. And yet I think many of us don't feel like we have the power to make that shift. You know, I'm one person and against all the corporations, all the governments, and the, dominated models we see out there. What do you tell people to help them stay steady, to know this really can happen?
Well, many things, but I'll just touch on two. First is, Margaret Mead remarked some time ago, something that is so relevant and so true, that all the good changes that we take for granted were due to a small, usually quite unpopular and maligned group of women and men. And I think we need to remember that. But also, and this is why my work has given so many people really this grounded hope for a better future, is that actually so much of what has been called new and radical, including the women's movement, of which, of course, Women of Wisdom, and the whole reclamation of the divine feminine, and everything that is stereotypically considered feminine, such as caring, caregiving, nonviolence, is such an important part. This is not new. This is not radical. It is deeply rooted in millennia, thousands of years of societies that oriented more to the partnership side of what my work and the work of many others today has identified as the partnership domination social scale. And yes, a key element of either the partnership configuration or the dominator or domination configuration is the status of women, and with it, the value in real terms, including economic terms, of what has stereotypically been relegated to women and the feminine: caring, caregiving, nonviolence, the very qualities that we urgently need, not only to thrive, but to survive.
Yes, yes, that's so true. So I was curious what challenges you've personally experienced to in bringing this evolution to humankind now, because you're really in the forefront. You write about this in so many books. But what are your personal challenges?
Well, let me count the ways. When you are challenging the given, so to speak, the things that we have been taught as truths, as valuable, right? As how things are, and by implication, always have been and always must be, you can expect a backlash, can't you? And I've certainly have dealt with that. Many people in many organizations, policies, people have been very empowered by this, but others have felt very threatened by it. And so that was, of course, one challenge. Talking about gender being central rather than, quote, just a women's issue, the way we've been taught to think of it, right? That too has been a challenge because of the fact that whether we think of ourselves as progressive or conservative or whatever, we've all been taught the same thing, that, gee, anything connected with women and the so-called feminine, it is less important, and yes, less valuable than anything stereotypically, because this has nothing to do with anything inherent in women or men, considered masculine. Like, well, some of the things that we're trying to leave behind, domination, violence. And so people go around, lots of people, saying, well, we have to be better, we have to be nicer, we have to be more caring, we have to, but they don't understand that to really change our values, the first thing is becoming conscious of what I've called the hidden system of gendered valuations. Mm. And that's very deeply embedded in both our conscious and unconscious minds, and in the social structures that we have inherited from more rigid domination times. So we are really talking about something that people who consider themselves progressive also seem to often relegate anything like, the feminine, women, to, yeah, we'll get to that after we've dealt with the, quote, more important things, right? You've heard that. And the fact is that none of the progressive goals can be realized without also addressing this fundamental matter of whether or not the two human forms, because they're two forms, female and male, lots in between, but still, whether they are linked or ranked. And that influences whether when people who see that masculine is superior to feminine, they have, or women are inferior to men, men have to dominate, etc. They have in-group versus out-group thinking in their minds. I mean, this is why I wrote my latest book, Nurturing Our Humanity, which draws heavily from neuroscience and shows that what children observe, experience in their early years, we know from neuroscience, affects nothing less than the structure of our brain, of our developing brain. And if they have this template, then they learn very early to associate difference, beginning with this fundamental difference in form in our species, with either dominating or being dominated, with either being served or serving. And yes, that then can be applied to a different race and is applied to a different race or religion or sexual orientation. And you see this writ large in that the most regressive and repressive modern regimes, I mean, it's all there in front of us, have had as a top priority always pushing us back to where children first acquire this template to an authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family.
Yes, and you mentioned, you know, it's in our consciousness and unconscious. Like there's patterning going on of programming that happens at the start of birth, you know, and continues. And I think as women, we're kind of faced with that. I think sometimes we get hit on the head like, oh, there I am again, you know, thinking, and whatever position, maybe it's because we feel someone's talking down to us, or someone's letting, you know, the men talk more, or I'm not speaking up. So, you know, that I don't feel like I can speak up because I'm not going to be, all those messages that we get that has been ingrained in us. And so what do you think, what do you think then women need to do to counter this, to get through this, to change that in, you know, it begins with ourselves and our minds. That's what you're talking about.
Well, it begins with changing our own consciousness. And I can attest that that's possible. I sometimes tell the story of, because, you know, my background is both in social science, system science, as well as an attorney. And when I was working years and years ago for a law firm, the head honcho called me in one day to really commend me on some of my work. And guess what he said to me? He said, "You don't think like a woman." And you know what? He not only meant it as a compliment, I took it. I took this terrible insult, which is what it is, you know, in this ranking, you know, you think like not think like a woman, you think like a man.
So therefore you're okay.
Yeah, then you're okay. I took it as a compliment without, you know, so I know that we can change our consciousness. And fact is that people who read my work say that it's full of aha experiences. And I have to say that doing the research for my books has been full of aha experiences for me too. But to answer your question, what do we need to do? Everything that we're doing. First of all, can start with a conversation, changing the conversation. You know, people unconsciously, very often, and as you say, consciously, have really internalized this, being aware of the amount of putting down. You know, you mentioned some of it. We're not taken seriously. We're not listened to. We're interrupted, right? And so then another thing is standing up to that. I mean, that's what the Me Too movement is about, basically. Um, that's what the women's liberation movement was about. Uh, that's what really the partnerism movement is about. Uh, recognizing that for millennia, and you know, there's a documentary being made about my life and my work called Humankind, which I kind of like because it's a play on words. And some of the interviews with experts are just fantastic for it. They sent them to me and I've been watching them. I mean, it is, you've got to change the story that we are told about, quote, human nature and human history. And it really starts with that caveman cartoon, doesn't it? You know, in one hand, he's got a weapon, you know, a club.
Right.
On the other hand, he's dragging a woman by the hair. Well, what does it tell a child before our brains are fully formed, much less our critical faculties, that, gee, violence, male dominance, that's how it's always been. That's how it always will be. Well, that is an untrue, that is a false story. And we all need to change that story, but we need to change a lot of stories. I wrote a book on economics called The Real Wealth of Nations. It's a play of words on Adam Smith's The Real Wealth of Nations, rather than just the wealth of nations that he wrote about. And both Smith and Marx, really, while they challenged some aspects of dominator economics, they left in place this hidden system of gendered values, so that caring for people, caring for nature, not a word about it in any of their writings. Quite the contrary. For them, caring for nature, nature was there to be exploited, period. As for caring for people starting in childhood, that was to be performed for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. And even as late as when Marx wrote, in many places, even then in the late 1800s, most of the time, women, wives, could not sue for injuries negligently inflicted on them. Only their husbands could, for loss of her services. So
Yeah.
we've got to know our history. We've got to get rid of this spurious distinction between reproductive and productive. We have had an economic map that ignores the three life-sustaining sectors as just reproductive: the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy. And of course, some of the policies that President Biden is proposing, I mean, he uses terms I introduced, like human infrastructure, like caring economics. Caring economics got co-opted to just mean direct care, but never mind. That's how change happens. It's a thin line between co-option and transformation. So let's hope we can move forward. But it's very exciting, this work, for all of us. And change is possible. I mean, look at human history. We have changed and we can change again. And many of the progressive social movements, I would say all of them, have challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination.
So I was curious, do you find any examples of partnership models in the world today that are working? Are there any governments or countries or societies that are making the shift?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we still have some, not all, some indigenous societies, gathering hunting societies like the Batek, for example, that are, well, I really want to backtrack for a moment on this. When I had been working, I worked on my books for many, many years, had been working on nurturing our humanity for 7 years, when I invited the anthropologist Douglas Fry to be my co-author. And one of the reasons I did is that Doug is one of the world's authorities on how we lived for millennia in gathering hunting societies, which he calls the original partnership societies. They were much more egalitarian in general, certainly gender balanced, egalitarian. And well, we know today from archaeology that even though we've been told war is just human nature, actually war is at most 5 to 10,000 years old. And these contemporary, like the Batek, they have very, very little violence in the society, much less, between groups. But then there are, on the other end, technologically speaking, societies, Northern European societies, like Finland, like Sweden, like Norway, that while not, see, it's always a matter of degree, this partnership, domination, social scale, they're certainly not ideal, and neither were the societies of our prehistory, my goodness. I mean, this is not a question of going back to any good old days, but it's using what we what we are learning about the configuration, and that gender equity is a key element of a more equitable and sustainable way of life. That's what it's about. But these societies, Northern European societies, as I said, like Norway, Finland, Sweden, they were so poor at the beginning of the 20th century, they were famines. I mean, whole states in the United States, Minnesota, got populated by people fleeing, these hardships. Today, and these are the societies with the lowest gender gaps, by the way, and I'll get back to that. Today, they invariably are in the highest tiers of the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports. They have far less poverty than the United States, far less crime than the United States. The first peace academies, peace studies, as well as the first laws, which is really fundamental, saying that violence in homes against children is against the law. These came out of these societies. And of course, women are in these societies about half of the national legislature. But it's not that women are better than men. I mean, we all know cruel women and caring men, right? It is that as the status of women rises, both men and women begin to also give more value to those traits and activities like caring, caregiving, and nonviolence that we've been taught to associate with women and the feminine. So guess what? They have universal health care. They have generous, very generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers. They invest much more of their national resources in caring for people, as well as caring for nature, by the way. I mean, because, women were supposed to keep a clean and healthy home environment. That translates into keeping what we must have, a clean and healthy and thriving planetary environment. In other words, they have more caring policies, and both women and men voted for these. So we're back to the importance of this gendered system of values. And in the Real Wealth of Nations, I, of course, show that, again, it is not inevitable. And frankly, as we enter the post-industrial knowledge service age, we must invest more in, well, the environmental crisis, we must invest more in caring for nature if we're to survive. But if we're to be economically successful, we must invest in what economists like to call high quality human capital. Why? Because we know from neuroscience that whether or not we have these resilient, we're empathic, people who can be creative, who can work in teams rather than taking or giving orders, it largely hinges on the quality of care and education children receive in those first years. So this is a matter of economic efficiency. And again, we've told the wrong story, aren't we?
There are some changes. I know there's some things being voted in for money to go to preschool, for free preschool for children in the area that I live. And, it's taken a long time to see the values of these things. And I hope we're going to reap the benefit that having voted that in, and the children are going to have free preschool, which is an important developmental time for socialization with the kids and everything, that we'll see the benefits of that years down the road. And but when you were talking, because you're talking about this gender thing, one thing you wrote about in one of your books, it was a chapter, it said woman as a force in history, and how there's not that much written about it. It's sort of like a lost history, like we're missing half of our history. And the woman, and I know, because we hear of stories here and there of powerful women who have been shaping our world, who have done things to shape our world, including yourself. That we don't, you almost have to research harder to find them.
Absolutely, and that must change. And I have to say that it has to change for not only men who have really been very much in charge of the canon, of what's taught as important knowledge and truth, but also for women. Because so often we find that a marginalized group, and we may be the majority, but we're marginalized, that they jockey for position. Mm-hmm. And we've got to stop that and support one another. And that's something that every one of us can do. There's so many little and big steps. I mean, there is a very direct line, really, between changing our consciousness and hence our behavior and changing policy. Mm-hmm. And we can all change policy. The problem is, I think that if parents would organize, for example, it's been very difficult because in the old, mindset, the dominator mindset, children are parental property. And so the big effort is, don't you interfere with my parenting. I was horrified. I was teaching a class at the University Online of Alabama, and here was this graduate student. And yes, telling me that, whipping children, that's not violence. That's just how we do things. Can you imagine? And even when I said, so you mean if I hit a stranger, I go to jail, but if I hit somebody who's smaller and totally dependent, that is okay? Yeah. It just didn't budge her.
Well, and it's that whole thing of property, women are property and children are property. And we still live with that in sometimes very subtle ways that we don't pick it up.
Well, it is very much behind a lot of what's happening politically, mm-hmm. With this whole absolute nonsense about, of course, we have institutionalized racism, but it's this in-group versus out-group thinking. In the Middle East, it's Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia. And not coincidentally, yes, women are very oppressed there.
Mhm.
And not coincidentally, a lot of the people who voted for Mr. Trump, studies show, have a horror of powerful women. And they also, another study which I didn't include in Nurturing Our Humanity because I didn't know about it, but which is fascinating, they, as parents, are much more concerned with conformity, with obedience, with what they call respect, which is really fear, than with creativity or self-expression. I mean, it's all there, but we have to point people to it so that they really look at the important studies. And I know we're bombarded by so much information, some of it misinformation, unfortunately. But we also have to be very careful because what we're still taught in the canon, in our schools, in our universities, perpetuates the old system, doesn't it?
True. And I picked up your book, Sacred Pleasure, today. Sometimes I'll just pick up a book, open to a page, and it said, what are we teaching our daughters? Which is what you're talking about now. Like, what can we teach our daughters so that they can become, be birthed into this world of partnership, of knowing their value? So what would you say today here in this, maybe we'll just end with this. What do you want to tell women about that? What can we do to teach our daughters to be powerful women?
Well, I think first of all, we have to redefine power, because just to have a woman step into the old definition of power, a power over, is not what we want.
Right.
We have to teach girls that we do have power with and power to, creative power. And part of that creative power is the power to really change norms. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? I mean, whether we're talking about economic rules, whether we're talking about attitudes, about sexuality or about spirituality, this God-fearing is a disaster, really, because it perpetuates the whole line, of command. And I think we have to tell our daughters that it is exciting and not to expect that everybody is going to agree with them, but it doesn't matter. And that really takes me to the very beginning of our conversation, to remember that we have the power, that everything we value has been because people did not accept old domination norms.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was the women's movement or the abolitionist movement or the civil rights movement or the movement for the environment. I mean, they all challenge the same thing, a tradition of domination, don't they? And once we have that power of a different worldview, and don't get seduced, that's one thing we have to tell our children. Look for the patterns, look for the partnership and domination patterns, never mind right, left, religious, secular, I mean, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. These are distractions. A friend of mine calls them weapons, the old categories, weapons of mass distraction. Mm-hmm. And look for resources. Go to a centerforpartnership.org. If your daughters are planning to have children or have children, we have a wonderful resource, the Caring and Connected Parenting Guide, based on the latest neuroscience in English and in Spanish. You can download it for free. But educate yourself in a different way of thinking and value yourself and understand that the story that this is just a women's issue is absolute nonsense. It's a lie.
Right. It's a human story. And just adding on to what you're saying, I think like a woman of wisdom, what I found is, we talked before about women's voices of practicing. So in a woman's So we've created safe women's circles for women to share and be witnessed. And the more we do that, the stronger our voices and the more we feel supported and go out there and speak and at places where we wouldn't before. We'd be afraid to speak up because of that dominator model, you know, and
It's so important because I know that very often when I speak, you know, and I give a lot of keynotes, people are engaged and yes, they get it, but then they're sucked back into the old norms, the old worldview. So it's important to have a group that will support a partnership way of looking at the world and somebody who will understand that we're talking about a very concrete thing, shifting from domination systems, whether they're Eastern or Western, Northern or Southern, religious or secular, to the partnership side. And that it can be done, it is being done, but we have to really speed it up.
Yeah, it's coming down to that for the survival of our planet too. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I really look forward to the conference.
Yes, everybody check that out. It's March 24th through 27th. Just go to the womenofwisdom.org website, look for conference 2022. Schedule is there, the presenters are there, and you can register. And we have an early bird price through January 15th. So check that out. And also Riane's website, centerforpartnership.org. So thank you everybody for listening today. And I'll be back interviewing more presenters in the future.
Bye-bye and see you soon.
Okay.